Over 400,000 German troops and 1,400 tanks smashed into a quiet, snow-covered section of the Allied line, creating the infamous Bulge. It was Hitler's last great gamble in the West, a massive offensive designed to split the Allies and force them to negotiate. The story we're often told is that this was a close call, a desperate battle the Allies almost lost. But that story is wrong. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't a daring gamble that almost worked. It was a catastrophe born from delusion, a plan so fundamentally broken it was doomed before the first tank started its engine. And the American soldiers who stood in frozen foxholes didn't just survive. They shattered Hitler's fantasy with their courage, turning what should have been a German breakthrough into a graveyard for Nazi ambitions. I've spent countless hours investigating this battle from every angle, the logistics, the intelligence, the tactical decisions, and each time the conclusion is unavoidable. This offensive was a dead-on arrival from the moment it was conceived. If you're like me and genuinely want to connect with the heroes who fought in World War II and honor their sacrifice, you know that AI-generated stories are a disservice to their legacy. That's why every story on WW2 Stories Explained is thoroughly researched, to ensure these incredible and brave stories are told with the care they deserve. Please support our channel by subscribing and share with fellow World War II history enthusiasts who feel the same way. By the fall of 1944, the walls were closing in on Nazi Germany. Allied armies were pushing from the west, and the Red Army was advancing relentlessly in the east. So, what does Hitler do? He dreams up one last grand offensive. Codenamed Watch on the Rhine, the plan was a ghost of the 1940 blitzkrieg that conquered France. The goal was breathtakingly huge: smash through the Ardennes forest, race across the Meuse River, and capture the critical port of Antwerp. This, Hitler figured, would cut the British and Canadian armies off from the Americans, tear the Western Allies apart, and force them to sue for peace. His own generals, guys like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model, were horrified. They knew it was a fantasy. They pushed for a smaller, more realistic attack, but Hitler, running on wishful thinking and a total underestimation of his enemy, wouldn't budge. It was Antwerp or nothing. And so Hitler balanced the whole operation on several incredibly shaky assumptions. These catastrophic miscalculations didn't just lose him the battle, they doomed millions to death, devastated an entire continent, and sealed the fate of the Third Reich itself. The first fatal flaw is that the panzer divisions had to capture Allied fuel dumps along the way, because Germany didn't have enough gas to get them there. Let that sink in. The success of the most important German offensive of the late war depended on their enemies conveniently leaving the gas stations open for them. German planners figured they had, at best, only half the fuel needed for the trip. This wasn't a strategy, it was a prayer. By late 1944, Germany was running on fumes. Allied bombing had systematically crushed Germany's synthetic oil plants, and losing the Romanian oil fields to the Soviets was a knockout blow. The Ardennes offensive was planned with a fuel shortage that would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. Elite units like Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored spearhead of the whole operation, were brought to a dead stop, not by enemy fire but by empty gas tanks. At one point, Piper's feared King Tiger tanks sat powerless just a few miles from massive American fuel depots at Spa and Stavelot, which held a combined 3.3 million gallons of gasoline. While German tanks were being ditched on the side of the road, the Allied supply machine, the famous Red Bull Express, was pumping thousands of tons of supplies to the front every single day. The battle was, in many ways, won in the oil refineries and pipelines long before the first shot was fired in the Ardennes. The second fatal mistake in Hitler's plan was his complete and utter contempt for the American soldier. This single underestimation would ultimately doom his army. Nazi propaganda painted the Americans as soft, materialistic, and undisciplined, a money-hunting nation that couldn't possibly stand up to a real fight. Hitler was convinced that once the shock of a true blitzkrieg hit, the American lines would shatter and the soldiers would run. He could not have been more wrong. The Ardennes front was seen as a quiet sector, a place where new, untested American divisions could get their bearings and battle-hardened units could rest. These were the exact troops the Germans targeted, thinking they'd be an easy knockout. But here's what the German High Command failed to understand. These weren't just statistics on a map. These were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, and kids fresh out of high school who'd been thrown into frozen foxholes with barely enough ammunition and told to hold the line. At places like St. Vith, small groups of American engineers, men trained to build bridges, not destroy armies, found themselves facing down panzer divisions. They didn't have the tanks. They didn't have air support. What they had was a simple choice, hold or run. And they held. For days, vastly outnumbered and surrounded, they turned crossroads into fortresses and bought precious time with their lives. At Elsenborn Ridge, American artillery crews worked their guns until the barrels glowed red hot, firing at point-blank range into advancing German columns. These weren't career soldiers with years of training. Many had been civilians just months earlier. But they understood something the German planners didn't. The guy next to you doesn't become expendable just because some general in Berlin drew lines on a map. And then there was Bastogne, when the 101st Airborne found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, low on ammunition, and freezing in the December cold. The German commander sent a formal surrender demand. He expected the rational response. These Americans were beaten. Why throw away lives for a hopeless position? But Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's response wasn't rational by German military standards. It was one word: nuts. That single word wasn't just defiance. It was a middle finger to every calculation Hitler had made about American resolve. The soldiers in Bastogne weren't fighting because they thought they could win. They were fighting because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. They scrounged ammunition from the dead, shared what little food they had, and treated their wounded in frozen cellars. They held that town not with superior tactics or equipment, but with something the Germans couldn't account for. They simply refused to quit. The plan called for these soft Americans to collapse in 48 hours. Instead, they turned the Ardennes into a graveyard for German ambitions. Every hour they held was an hour the panzers weren't racing toward Antwerp. Every crossroads they defended was another nail in the coffin of Hitler's fantasy. The soldiers who were supposed to be the weak link became the iron wall that the entire offensive shattered against. Hitler had sent his best remaining troops to exploit American weakness, only to discover that courage doesn't show up on intelligence reports, and it can't be calculated in a war room hundreds of miles from the front. While the German High Command was underestimating the American G1, another fatal flaw emerged on the horizon. This time, the whole initial attack relied on one thing no general can control: the weather. The offensive was launched under a thick blanket of fog and low clouds, which did exactly what the Germans hoped. It grounded the Allies' single biggest advantage, their air force. For about a week, German tanks and troops could move without the constant fear of fighter bombers tearing them to pieces from above. But weather changes, and basing your entire strategy on a cloudy sky is a fool's game. Just as the German advance started to bog down from fuel shortages and stiff American resistance, the skies began to clear. On December 23rd, the clouds broke. What happened next was a massacre from the air. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons swarmed the skies, unleashing hell on the German columns, which were now stuck in massive traffic jams on the narrow Ardennes roads. Tanks that had survived American ground forces were now sitting ducks. Supply lines, already stretched to their limit, were completely severed. The brief German advantage vanished. The same forests that had hidden their attack now became a trap, funneling them into killing zones for Allied planes. The Bulge had reached its limit. In one of the most incredible logistical feats of the war, Patton's Third Army turned 90 degrees and raced north to break the siege of Bastogne, punching right into the side of the German advance. By Christmas Eve, the offensive was, for all intents and purposes, over. The Germans weren't even close to the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. Their best tanks were wrecked or abandoned, their troops were exhausted, and their supplies were gone. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't lost in the snow. It was lost on paper in Hitler's headquarters months earlier. It was doomed by a strategy that confused hope for a plan, by a supply chain that ran on fumes, and by an arrogant, profound misunderstanding of the enemy's will to fight. And yet, the real victory was won by the ordinary Allied troop who held the line in the freezing snow and possibly under siege. They held the line not because of superior equipment or grand strategy, but because of something deeper: courage, loyalty to the men beside them, and a stubborn refusal to let tyranny win. Instead of buying Germany time, Hitler's last big gamble just sped up the end. It was a final violent spasm from a dying regime that had chosen fantasy over reality. A costly lesson that wars are not won by wishful thinking, but by brutal, unforgiving arithmetic. The Battle of the Bulge proved that massive offensives built on wishful thinking will always crumble against cold, hard reality. But sometimes in war, it's not about the size of your army. It's about one individual who refuses to break. Just a few years earlier, a different kind of soldier faced impossible odds in the frozen forest of Finland. If you want to continue to feel connected to history and honor the heroes of World War II, and see how one quiet farmer stopped an entire Soviet army in its tracks, check out our video on Simoheha, the White Death. If you want to connect with World War II history, watching my documentaries is the right next step. Subscribe now to join us, discover engaging World War II stories, and stay updated on new documentaries so you can share these stories and cherish their experiences. Click the video on screen now.